Written versus unwritten constitutions. Now in America, we're very familiar with the idea of written constitutions, that our constitutions are written down in pen and ink, printed on a piece of paper. So the idea of an unwritten constitution may be kind of strange to us. And there's a particular historical reason for that. Because Americans specifically desired a written constitution in contrast to an unwritten constitution within the original colonies or the states. And then, of course, the American Constitution, or the U.S. Constitution, which is the longest lasting national constitution, written national constitution thus far, over 200 years old. This is not to say a constitution is an unqualified good. That being said, the Americans specifically wanted a written constitution. Well, what was the alternative? Well, there is such a thing as an unwritten constitution. An unwritten constitution can be workable in the sense that an unwritten constitution is sort of the nexus between legal decisions of a parliament, an elected body, executive decisions of kings, and then the interpretation of judges. And as those things kind of morph together, it becomes a legal tradition known as a constitution. England has and had an unwritten constitution. And it obviously kind of works for them. British Constitution. You could look it up and see, there are people who have written down the traditions, but there's no official document of the British Constitution because it's an unwritten constitution. The issue with that is that during the time and leading up to the time of the American Revolution, the written Constitution of Britain, unwritten Constitution of Britain, was seen as fairly flexible by political elites, which is, you may notice, pretty convenient, that people in power tend to interpret their right to use power and think that they are right in doing so, that they have the authority to do so. And so, what the unwritten constitution basically meant in practice was that the English government could interpret its own actions as constitutional because of the flexibility of having an unwritten constitutional tradition. The Americans in the American Revolution argued that the actions of the British were unconstitutional, and therefore the British, by breaking their covenant with the Americans, their legal covenant to which the government rulers of the past had agreed, the Americans were no longer bound to follow the British government, and so they exited. The Americans in their colonies, which would become the states, and eventually in the Articles of Confederation and in the U.S. Constitution itself, saw the necessity of a written constitution. Now, just the fact that it was written down builds in an implicit presupposition about the meaning and interpretation of the Constitution. Now again, the Constitution is not an unqualified good, meaning that it could never be changed and that it is an end in itself. It's just an administrative document that lays out the framework for the U.S. federal government and the laws by which that government is supposed to be bound. That being said, the very fact that it is written down communicates that political elites are not to pursue their own agendas, whatever they may be, whether they're maybe good or bad. Every cause that we undertake is good in our own eyes, and it's the same with people in politics. But that they are not allowed to simply interpret the Constitution into meaninglessness in order to facilitate their own political ideology. The fact that the Constitution is written down means something. And it meant that there was a built-in limit to the interpretive power of political elites. So the idea that, well, the Constitution's old, which is true, and it may be, there are aspects of it that are in need of maybe update or changing or whatever the case may be. All that can be valid. However, the way to rectify the situation should not be through politicians simply deciding that they will interpret the Constitution in such a way as to render void the words and sentences. Because that simply comes back to the idea of what the Americans were facing with the British and their unwritten Constitution in the first place. It's to make the Constitution void, where political elites and the power that they're able to amass is really the final authority rather than the Constitution. That was the issue of the American Revolution. So, the Constitution can be changed, can be amended. There's a process for doing that, and there is some debate of whether the Constitution can really bind in general. It should bind the federal government, but the fact of the matter is the states that accepted and ratified it, those ratifying conventions were a minority of people years ago. That's not how contracts work. So there are those aspects of it, but a written constitution is important. On the other hand, let me make the argument now for the unwritten constitution. In reality, all constitutions are in a sense unwritten. Because the fact is that if people do not believe certain things and hold certain values and do not hold their government accountable to those values, then, would be expressed in a constitution, then it doesn't matter what's written down. Lysander Spooner, who was an abolitionist during the time of before, during, and after the U.S. Civil War, Northerner, and wrote an interesting book called No Treason. But he made an argument saying the Constitution either gave us the government we have, this is the written Constitution, or is powerless to prevent it. Meaning, all the problems that we have today politically, maybe we should blame the Constitution, because it, either accidentally or on purpose, facilitated a system that gave us all our problems that we have today. Not exclusively, not every single problem that exists, but our problems regarding the government. For example, people talk about, well, Washington said we shouldn't have political parties, but the Constitution kind of facilitates a system where political parties are pretty much going to be the result. So, his first part of that statement is maybe the Constitution is the problem. The Constitution itself might be the issue. That the Constitution is either the problem or has given us such a government as we have had. Or, the other side, maybe the Constitution's not to blame, but the written Constitution was powerless to prevent the government that we have, the results that we experience today and throughout U.S. history. Because Lysander Spooner was writing in the 1860s and 70s. So, maybe a written constitution, while it maybe arguably could provide more limits than otherwise would have been there over government, it has either brought about the problems that we have, according to Spooner, or it was powerless to stop it. I often say that a piece of paper will not stop people in power from doing bad things. There have to be things that they can't just interpret or remove based on themselves. And there are those checks and balances and things of that nature, but are those sufficient? And so, really, at the fundamental level, take something like the First Amendment and free speech. The American value of free speech, imperfect as it has been, is not because in the National Archives there's this parchment called the Constitution on which there's a First Amendment written in there. That it really has to be in the society, in the valuation of the American people, whether and to what extent they will value freedom of speech, freedom of expression. If Americans stop valuing these things and understanding the basis on which the importance of free speech rests, then it won't matter. And if they aren't willing to hold government accountable to its guarantee of that right, if that changes, it won't matter what a piece of paper says. So really the Constitution has to be kind of in the spirit of the American people. And so you have arguments for and against written constitution.